Dr. Ken Landau, let's talk about protecting your skin against the ravages of ultraviolet light, against the sun. We know it's very important because if you go out in the sun, you're going to suffer significant damage that's cumulative, and over time your skin is going to look old, wrinkled, and haggard. You're going to develop brown spots, age spots. You're going to develop melasma if you're a woman on your upper lip and across your nose and cheeks and forehead. You're going to develop pre-malignant keratoses and skin cancers and melanoma. And if you have certain diseases like lupus, it's going to flare if you're exposed to the sun, or if you're taking antibiotics, maybe in the tetracycline or sulfa family. Maybe you take an antihypertensive or a water pill. Maybe if you simply put on some fragrance, some cologne, some perfume, maybe that's going to damage your skin when it's exposed to the sun. And you can get significant damage without even getting red. It's just that chronic exposure, the couple minutes here, couple minutes there over a period of time, going to cause your skin to freckle and discolor. And you can even see by age 15 or 30, people are going to have significant sun damage. Compare the skin of your buttocks at however old you are to the skin of your face, or the back of your hands, or the back of your forearm. You already see that there is some damage. You don't have to become very old, but when you look at older people, you look at people in their 60s and 70s or 80s, you see the very thin skin, you see the vessels right through the skin, you see the brownish discoloration because of the bleeding into the skin, the purplish discoloration. It's all from damage from the sun. The sun hits the skin, forms free radicals. The free radicals damage the collagen and the elastic tissue. The skin becomes thinner, and it becomes prematurely aged and susceptible to cancer. And then you go out and you spend enormous amounts of money on cosmetics and toiletries. You go and spend on anti-aging products. Go over to the spa, get a laser therapy or a peel. Maybe you go to the doctor because you have a skin cancer. We know this year there are going to be probably around 4.5 million basal cell carcinomas due to exposure to the sun, almost all of them. There will be about 40,000 melanomas, 2/3 of them, due to exposure to the sun. And the sun, the damaging ultraviolet ray, is going to come right through on a cloudy day. So who should be especially careful? Everyone should be especially careful. But people who are most at risk for damage have fair complexion or freckles, have blue eyes, have hair that's either blonde or red. Maybe they have a history, personal or family, of skin cancer. And we even see the damage in African Americans. So look at an African American's face who's over age 50, and you'll see mottled discoloration. That's all from chronic sun exposure. So you wouldn't think that a heavily pigmented individual would have to use a sunscreen or use a hat, but they really do. The old idea was that most of the damage occurred in youth, prior to age 20 or 25, but with our changing activities and extra leisure time at the pool, at the lake, at participating in sports, we get damage throughout our lifetime. And you have to realize that there's a significant lag as far as skin cancers are concerned. So the damage you get when you're 5 and 10 and 15 and 20 and 30 and 40 is going to lead to the mottled discoloration when you're 40 and 50, and the skin cancer when you're 60, even if you've stopped going out in the sun 20 or 30 years ago. When should you start protecting your skin against the sun? Protect it starting when you're very young. Sunscreens are approved for children over 6 months of age. Well, there are a lot of factors involved in determining when damage is going to occur. So it's the latitude, the time of the day, the time of the year, the altitude, whether it's cloudy or not, whether you're likely to get reflection from water or sand. Well, those factors have to be considered. Sunscreen, that's just one part of protection against damage from the sun. Even more important is clothing. You should either stay inside, stay under an umbrella, or wear appropriate clothing. It starts with a hat that has at least a 4-inch brim. If you wear a baseball cap, the sun's going to come in from the side and damage your skin at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And you have to consider sunglasses to protect your eyes and the skin around your eyes, and also consider appropriate clothing. Long sleeve shirt or blouse, long pants. Have to do that because otherwise you will suffer the damage. You will suffer the aging of your skin. Look at your skin, again, when you're 50 or 60. Compare it to the skin on your buttock. buttock goes outside every time your arm goes outside, but it doesn't get the damage. So if the sunscreen doesn't work on your face to make your face look better than your buttocks, why don't you consider whatever you're doing to your buttocks? And that's simply applying a piece of cloth. Well, the piece of cloth that you pick is very important. You don't have to go out and buy a special piece of cloth that's been treated with some SPF chemical. What you can do is pick a fabric that when you hold it up against the light doesn't let the light go through. It should be dry because we know that when it's wet it doesn't protect nearly as much, and should be dark because if it's white it doesn't protect as much as it is if it's black or blue or red. We know you have to spend extra time protecting the ears and the nose and the sides of the neck. How likely are people to use appropriate sunscreens? Not very. The Centers for Disease Control evaluated a series of people outside for more than an hour and found only 1 in 7 men and 1 in 3 women were using sunscreen adequately. A lot of women say, look, I put on my sunscreen every day. It's in my cosmetic or it's in my moisturizer, and guess what? It doesn't work very well at all. And it doesn't provide all-day protection. And it doesn't provide universal protection because it only provides a little bit of protection against UVB, and the UVB rays aren't likely to be present when you're outside. Well, sunscreens, the standalone variety that you go out and buy, the Coppertone or the Neutrogena or whatever you buy, well, they come in a variety of vehicles. So the vehicle could be a cream or a lotion or a gel or a spray. We don't recommend the sprays. And they come in the balms for the lip. They don't seem to work very well. And you can't rely on whatever the number is, that SPF whatever. Well, that probably gives you a false sense of security. But remember, people who rely on sunscreen rather than clothing or shade are going to be sun damaged. Now, in the old days, you could talk about a sunblock or a waterproof or sweat-proof sunscreen or sun protection. But now you can't use the term sunblock because they don't block the sun. They screen the sun. And they're not waterproof, and they're not sweat-proof. Water-resistant product might last up to 40 minutes. A very water-resistant product might last up to 80 minutes. But that's it. Then it has to be reapplied. All of the products have to be reapplied about every 2 hours. We divide the ultraviolet light, the damaging light, which is not visible to the eye. We divide the ultraviolet light into 3 different categories: UVA, UVB, UVC. Traditionally, UVC is going to be screened by the ozone. It's very damaging. Thank goodness it's screened out by the ozone. We have UVB, that traditionally are the sun-burning rays, and we have the UVA rays, and those are the tanning and the damaging rays, the wrinkling rays. So the UVA is what you get when you go over to the suntan parlor. The UVB principally is what you get when you go outside in June, July, and August, between about 10 o'clock in the morning and about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, when you look at a sunscreen, it typically is going to have a number on it, like an SPF of 15, SPF of 30. The SPF testing is done inside in a laboratory, and it's not really reflective of its use in the outdoors. Its use when you go out and sweat. Its use when you use it the way it's meant to be used. So what does SPF mean? SPF is the additional time that you get outside before you burn when you use the product versus when you don't use the product. So let's say it takes you 10 minutes to burn if you just go outside without any protection. Now if you use an SPF of 15, it should take you 15 times longer to get red. So if it takes you 10 minutes without the sunscreen and you use a sunscreen of SPF 15, it's 10 times 15 or 150 minutes. Well, remember, that's more than 2 hours, and you have to reapply the sunscreen because it becomes relatively ineffective after 2 hours. So what's the difference? How long it lasts? So if you were to consider it takes you 10 minutes to get a sunburn without a product, now you use an SPF of 50. Well, 10 times 50 is 500 minutes, but you have to apply it every 120 minutes. So that doesn't make any difference. Now, what does SPF mean? SPF, if you look at an SPF of 15, it will block about 93% of the UVB rays. Those are the burning rays. Has nothing to do with the damaging rays, nothing to do with the rays that cause the skin to age, nothing to do with the rays that cause the skin to turn brown and become discolored. The SPF prevents the UVB only, period, end of story. The SPF of 15 will prevent 93% of the UVB from passing through the skin. The UV, if we talk about an SPF of 30, it's going to prevent 97%. If we talk about an SPF of 50, it'll prevent 98%. So an SPF of 30 is not twice as strong as an SPF of 15. The UVB rays that the SPF prevents from damaging the skin on a theoretical basis, well, they're limited to the time in the summertime, June, July, and August, and from about 10 o'clock in the morning till about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The rest of the time, you get the UVA rays. Now, a lot of people worry about protecting themselves against the UVB rays because it's the UVB rays that make the skin produce the vitamin D. That's not an issue. Don't worry about it. Put sunscreen on if you're going to, and put an adequate quantity on. Now, SPF is one of those kind of things that's a little controversial. In fact, in Australia, the society, the law, says you can't use any SPF, you can't label it as more than a 30. In Europe and in Japan, they say you can't label them as more than 50. Here in the United States, there's a regulation that will be effective in the relatively near future, and it says that you can't label a sunscreen in the United States as more than an SPF 50 or 50 plus. Unfortunately, we don't have any ratings for the UVA products, but in Europe, if you're going to have a broad spectrum sunscreen, it has to provide at least 1/3 of the protection against UVA as it does against UVB. What's that mean in practical terms? Well, if you use an SPF of 15, you have to have ultraviolet A protection, to call it a broad spectrum sunscreen. You have to have, if it's SPF 15, it has to provide at least a 5 against UVA. Well, it's very important to realize that even if you don't get sunburn, even if you put a sunscreen on your skin, you will still get sun that goes through. Ultraviolet rays will go through, and they will cause damage. They will cause subclinical damage. And that subclinical damage will be cumulative, and you will find out when you get to be 50 or 60 that putting that sunscreen on didn't provide the same degree of protection that you thought. And if we were to do a microscopic analysis of your skin, we would see the damage. With the broad spectrum sunscreens, there's a lot of controversy because they don't seem to provide the benefits that you would expect. Now, by law, if a product is not labeled a broad spectrum sunscreen, or if it contains an SPF of anywhere between 2 and 14, it can't put on the label that it can prevent aging or prevent cancer. It can only say that it can prevent sunburns. It's very important to realize additionally that we have several different kinds of sunscreens. We have the chemical sunscreens and the physical sunscreens. The chemical sunscreens are avobenzone. They're chemicals that absorb the ultraviolet activity and can undergo some changes on the skin. They can be somewhat photo-unstable. So in other words, when the sun hits them, they can deteriorate. And that's why when we talk about the chemical sunscreens, most sunscreens actually contain 2 or 3 or 4 different sunscreens. Sunscreens to protect each other and to hopefully protect you. Well, we also have the physical sunscreens. The physical sunscreens actually go and scatter or reflect the ultraviolet activity. These are chemicals like zinc oxide or titanium dioxide. They're considerably less elegant cosmetically. Most products contain a combination of the two. A lot of additional claims are made. Some of the sunscreen products say they're good for sensitive skin, or they're organic, or they're natural, or they're preservative-free, or they're non-comedogenic, non-acne-causing, or they're animal-safe. But we know that, unfortunately, none of the products seem to provide as much protection as people think. If we're talking about the UVA filters, the zinc oxide seems to work much better than the titanium dioxide, but unfortunately, there's not enough percentage in the sunscreens to really provide adequate protection. So the Consumer Reports, after evaluating the sunscreens, doesn't rate any of the physical sunscreens as recommended products. And we know that the FDA requires the manufacturers of these sunscreens to perform tests so that they can show that the SPF of 15 or 30 is actually legitimate, but they don't require them to submit the material. They just have to be kept. The material has to be kept, so in case they do an audit, and as a result, Consumer Reports finds that somewhere between 40 and 50% of the sunscreens don't provide the SPF that they're labeled with, and then they provide less protection than expected. Well, how do you decide how much protection you need? You have to look to the UV index. The UV index can't be calculated by going outside and looking at the sun. The the ultraviolet index, UV index, is a computer simulation. It has to do with the different rays, the different wavelengths striking the Earth, how much is absorbed by the ozone, how much is absorbed as it crosses through the sun at different times, whether we have clouds or not, what the concentration of the ozone is or not, what the elevation is, what the time of the day, the time of the year. All of those factors are considered, and then they come up with the UV index. And the UV index, if the UV index is low, say 0 to 2, you could spend about an hour in the sun without getting burned. On the other hand, if it's a moderate UV index of 3 to 5, you could spend maybe 45 minutes without getting burned. And a high UV index, 6 or 7, you could spend as much as 30 minutes in the sun without getting burned. But now, as it gets to be a very high index, say maybe between 8 and 10, you could only spend 15 minutes. An extreme ultraviolet index, when it's more than 15, more than 11, up to 15, then you can provide only about 10 minutes in the sun before you get burned. As an example of how the UV index at the same time of year varies between different locations. In the summertime, in Los Angeles or Las Vegas, the UV index might be 11, whereas at the same time, the UV index in Michigan or Minnesota might be 8, and the UV index in Texas might only be 2 or 3. So that's how we determine how much sunscreen you need, or how much sun protection you need, or what the damage is when you go outside in the sun. Now, what do we know specifically about the sunscreens? Tune in to part 2 and I'll tell you. Thanks for watching. I'm Dr. Ken Landau.